"Can I stay with you tonight?" She asked it the way a person asks for something they've already decided they don't deserve. Quiet, steady, not quite meeting his eyes. Her wrist still carried the bruise from the man he'd just put on the floor. Her coat was thin for the cold. She had nothing left, and they both knew it. Jake Sullivan looked at this woman who hadn't broken, despite everything designed to break her, and felt something shift in his chest that 12 years of careful silence hadn't prepared him for. "Yeah," he said, "you can stay." Neither of them knew that one word had just changed everything. If this story moved you, subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Grace's journey travels. The man holding Grace's wrist was named Cutter. She didn't know that yet. What she knew was that his grip was the kind that left bruises shaped like fingerprints, and that he smelled like sour mash, and something worse underneath the particular stink of a man who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered. His two friends stood up from the corner table the moment the stranger spoke. Chairs scraped wood, glasses rattled. Nobody else in the Bitter Creek saloon moved. That said everything. "This ain't your business, friend," Cutter said, not releasing her arm, not even turning to look at the man behind him. That was a choice. The choice of someone who believed his reputation preceded him enough that he didn't need to acknowledge a threat. "I'm making it mine," the voice said. Grace turned her head. She couldn't help it. And what she saw was not what she expected. He wasn't a big man. Not the kind of broad, towering figure that usually intervened in saloon trouble. He was lean, trail-worn, with a canvas coat that had seen too many winters, and a hat pulled low enough that his eyes were half in shadow. He stood perfectly still in the center of the room with his hands loose at his sides, and that stillness was the most frightening thing about him, not because it looked dangerous, but because it looked completely indifferent to whether it became dangerous or not. Jake Sullivan didn't want trouble. He'd had enough trouble to last 3 lifetimes. But he had walked into the Bitter Creek saloon for a whiskey and a quiet hour, and what he'd found instead was a woman being dragged off a bar stool by a man who outweighed her by 100 pounds, and some things you couldn't unknow once you'd seen them. "Last time," Jake said. Let go of her arm. Cutter finally turned around. He was a thick-necked man, red-faced with small eyes that had the flat quality of someone who had learned early that violence solved most problems and hadn't been proven wrong often enough to change the lesson. He looked Jake up and down with the practiced contempt of a man measuring a threat and deciding it wasn't one. "You got any idea who I ride with, stranger?" "Don't care," Jake said. That was the wrong answer as far as Cutter was concerned. The right answer would have been an apology and a retreat toward the door. The right answer would have been the kind of careful, self-preserving calculation that most men in Bitter Creek performed instinctively whenever Cutter's name came up. The fact that this lean, quiet stranger didn't seem to be doing any calculation at all, that unsettled something behind Cutter's eyes, just briefly, before the contempt reasserted itself. He shoved Grace sideways hard enough that she caught the edge of the bar with her hip to keep from going down and squared himself to Jake. "Then you're about to find out." What happened next was fast. Not dramatic. Not the slow cinematic kind of violence that men rehearsed in their heads beforehand. Just fast the way it always actually was, Grace would think later. Cutter swung. Jake moved. Not much, just enough tilting his head to one side so the fist went past his ear, and then his elbow came up and caught Cutter across the jaw with a crack that sounded like a green branch breaking. Cutter sat down on the floor with the dazed, stunned expression of a man who had expected the world to behave a certain way and had just discovered it was capable of something else entirely. The first friend charged. Jake sidestepped and put a boot into his knee, and the man went down hard and didn't get back up. The second friend looked at Jake, then at his two companions on the floor, then back at Jake, who stood in exactly the same position he'd been standing in before any of it happened. Hands loose, expression unchanged, not even breathing particularly hard. The second friend picked up his hat and walked out the door. Silence settled over the saloon. Jake looked at the bartender. "Sorry about the trouble." He looked at Grace. "You all right?" She had both hands wrapped around the edge of the bar. Her hip was going to bruise tomorrow. Her heart was slamming against her ribs, in the specific rhythm of fear that hadn't fully registered yet, because the threat had resolved too fast for her body to catch up. She was calculating not dramatically, just the constant exhausting arithmetic of someone who had been doing it for 2 years. Where is the next threat? Which exit is fastest? Who in this room is safe and who isn't? Jake Sullivan, she decided after 3 seconds, was the safest person in any room he was standing in. "I'm fine," she said. He nodded once like he believed her, even though it was obvious she was lying, and turned back toward the bar. That was the moment Grace noticed something strange. He wasn't going to help her further. He wasn't going to ask her what she was doing alone in a saloon at that hour, or why she looked like she'd traveled hard and eaten poorly, or any of the questions that men usually leveraged into obligation. He had stepped in because he'd seen something that required it, and now he considered the matter closed. She didn't know what to do with that. "Can I?" She stopped herself, tried again. "Can I sit here just for a minute?" Jake glanced sideways at the empty stool 2 down from his. "It's a public bar." She sat. He ordered a whiskey. Didn't order one for her, didn't not order one for her, just waited to see if she'd ask for her own. When she asked the bartender for water, he didn't comment on that either. Just sat with his whiskey and looked at the bottles on the shelf behind the bar with the particular focused blankness of a man giving himself permission to be nowhere important for 10 minutes. She found out his name from the bartender, who addressed him as Mr. Sullivan when he slid the drink across the wood. "You passing through?" Grace asked. "Probably." "You don't know." "I know I got here yesterday," Jake said. "What happens after that usually depends on what comes up." "That's not much of a plan." "It's not much of a life," he agreed without self-pity. "Just stating a fact." Grace turned that over. There was something in the flatness of it. Not depression exactly, more like a man who had pared his existence down to what was necessary and had stopped grieving the rest. She recognized that. She'd been doing something similar for 2 years, just from necessity rather than choice. Cutter was still sitting on the floor. Nobody was helping him up. "Those men," Grace said, keeping her voice low, "they're going to be angry." "Probably." "They ride with Bill Hutchins." That name she watched carefully for a reaction. In 3 towns now, Bill Hutchins's name had been the thing that closed doors and dropped voices and ended conversations. In Bitter Creek, men crossed the street when his riders came through. The saloon owner paid a cut of the bar receipts every month. The sheriff hadn't been seen in public in 6 weeks, and people had stopped asking why. Jake took a sip of his whiskey. "That means something particular to you. It means those men are going to tell him what happened here." "What does that mean for you?" She hesitated. The honest answer was complicated and long, and involved things she hadn't told anyone since leaving Millard County 14 months ago. The short answer was everything. Bill Hutchins was not directly the reason she was in Bitter Creek, but he was part of the ecosystem of the same kind of men, the kind who traded in women's debts and men's desperation, the kind who turned hardship into leverage and leverage into control. "It means I need to not be here when they come back," she said. Jake looked at her for the first time since she'd sat down. Not assessing, not the way most men looked at her, measuring her face and figure against whatever they were hoping for. Just looking the way someone looks at a problem they're trying to understand accurately before they decide what to do about it. "Where are you going?" he asked. "I don't know yet." "You got anywhere to sleep tonight?" The honest answer was no. She had $11.40 a bag with 2 changes of clothes, and a photograph she couldn't bear to look at and couldn't bear to throw away, and a horse she'd bought for $9 2 weeks ago that was already starting to go lame in the left foreleg. She had been sleeping in barn lofts and empty buildings when she could find them. Last night, she'd slept in the open under a stand of cottonwood trees because there'd been nowhere else. "I'll find something," she said. Jake looked at her for 1 more second. Then he looked back at the bottles. "My camp's north of town," he said, "about a mile up the creek. It's not much I got a lean-to and a fire ring, but there's room and nobody's going to bother you there. I'll take you, or I'll tell you how to find it. Or you can stay here, up to you." It was the last part that got her. Up to you. Two words that she hadn't heard applied to her own situation in so long that they sounded almost foreign, like a phrase from a language she used to speak and had mostly forgotten. The men in her life, starting with her father, and ending, God willing, with the man she'd run from in Millard County, had operated on the assumption that her preferences were a category of information that didn't require consulting. Her father had arranged her future with the cheerful confidence of a man selling livestock. The man he'd sold it to had confirmed that confidence in ways that left marks she still carried. Choice was not something Grace Porter had a lot of practice with. "Tell me how to find it," she said. "I want to see it first." Something shifted in Jake's expression, not much, just a fraction. Like that answer had surprised him in a way he approved of. He told her. Maud. She found the camp exactly where he'd said it would be. The lean-to was rough-built, practical, designed for function, rather than comfort. 3 walls of cut timber and a canvas roof stretched over a frame of pine poles positioned to catch south wind and deflect north wind, with the creek close enough to hear and far enough not to flood. The fire ring was a careful circle of river stones, and the wood beside it was stacked with the deliberate neatness of someone who didn't waste effort but didn't cut corners on the things that mattered. There was a bedroll inside the lean-to. One, already laid out. Grace stood outside it in the dark for a long time. The camp said something about him. Neat without being rigid. Functional without being cold. The kind of camp a man made when he'd been moving for a long time and had learned what mattered and what didn't. No luxury, no complaint. Just the careful, competent arrangement of what was necessary. She unsaddled her horse and picketed him near Jake's, a big gray that lifted its head and regarded her placidly, and went back to grazing. She ate the last of the hardtack from her saddlebag. She sat on a log near the fire ring and looked at the stars for a while and tried to stop calculating long enough to breathe. She didn't sleep. Not really, but she rested, which was close. Jake came back 2 hours later, quiet enough that she heard the horse before she heard him. He unsaddled, picketed, moved through the camp with the economy of long practice. When he saw her sitting by the fire ring he'd built up on the way in, he stopped. "Didn't think you'd be here," he said. "Neither did I," Grace admitted. He sat on the other log, fed a stick into the fire. The silence between them was not the uncomfortable kind, it was the kind that comes between two people who are both privately more comfortable with quiet than with the noise most people made to cover it. After a while, Grace said, "Why did you do it in the saloon?" He took a moment before he answered. "Because he had hold of you, and you hadn't asked him to." That's it. What else would there be? She thought about that. Most men would have looked the other way. Cutter's reputation. Other men's reputations aren't my concern. You weren't afraid of him. Jake looked at the fire. "I've been in situations a lot more dangerous than Cutter," he said, and said it so flatly, so without any pride in it, that she believed it completely. Whatever those situations were, they had clearly not left him nostalgic. "What kind of situations?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "The kind where people die, and you can't stop it, and you spend the next few years trying to figure out if you did enough." She didn't ask further. Some things you could hear in a person's voice and know that the story behind it was longer than a campfire conversation could hold. "I need to leave Bitter Creek tomorrow," she said instead. "I know. Hutchkins' men will be looking." "Probably." "I don't have enough money to go far," she said, "and my horse is going lame." She said it without self-pity, just laying out the facts the way she'd learned to, clearly without embellishment, because embellishment cost energy she rarely had to spare. Jake listened to each fact the same way, without the expression of uncomfortable sympathy that most people made when they heard her situation. The expression that meant they were calculating how quickly they could refer her problem to someone else. He didn't offer to solve it either. He just said, "Let me look at the horse in the morning." That was all. The fire burned down. The creek made its sound in the dark. Grace felt something happen in her chest. Not warmth, exactly, not safety exactly, but the beginning of something adjacent to both. The very early stages of some process she couldn't yet name. She had been alone for 14 months, Alone in the specific grinding way that meant always being the only person in the room looking out for yourself, always being the one doing all the watching and all the calculating and all the running. There had been kind people along the way, a woman in Redstone who'd given her a meal, a rancher's wife in Cotter's Falls, who'd let her sleep in a real bed for 2 nights. But kind people were not the same as people you could trust not to sell that kindness later. Jake Sullivan was something else, and she couldn't yet articulate what. "Can I stay?" she asked. And then before he could answer, "Not, I don't mean—" "I know what you mean," he said quietly. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, and his face in the firelight was complicated, tired mostly with the deep tiredness of someone who'd been carrying something heavy for long enough that they'd stopped noticing the weight. "Then can I stay tonight?" The question sat between them for a moment. Jake turned and looked at her directly. Not measuring, not hoping for anything. Just reading the situation with those calm, flat eyes of someone who had learned to see things clearly because the cost of not seeing clearly was sometimes too high to survive. "Yeah," he said. "You can stay." She woke before dawn to the sound of him already moving, feeding the fire, seeing to the horses existing with that same quiet competence. He looked at her horse's left foreleg for a long time, pressing along the tendon with careful fingers, watching the animal's responses. "Stone bruise," he said finally. "Not the tendon. She'll be okay in a few days if you don't push her." "I can't afford a few days." "You can't afford a lame horse," he said, which was accurate and fair, and she didn't argue with it. She helped him rebuild the fire. She was not a helpless woman. She'd never been helpless, not even in Millard County, though that time had come close to making her believe she was. She knew how to cook over open flame, how to read a horse, how to navigate by stars and landmarks. She'd learned those things by necessity, the same way she'd learned most things in the compressed and difficult classroom of survival. They ate without much conversation. Trail food, dried beef biscuits she'd made the night before in a pan she'd borrowed from a kitchen in Redstone and never returned. Jake produced coffee from somewhere in his gear reel coffee, and she held the tin cup with both hands and closed her eyes for a moment over the steam. "You said you were leaving," Jake said. "I am." "Where?" "North. I have an aunt in Laramie, I think. I haven't had contact in 2 years. I don't know if she'll take me in." She paused. "I don't know if she's still alive." "That's a long ride." "Yes." "Alone." "Yes." She looked at him. Unless... She stopped herself. She was not going to ask for more than he'd already given. She had already asked him for more than she usually permitted herself to ask anyone. The question formed anyway, and she held it back, and the effort of holding it back was visible enough that he saw it. "Unless what?" he said. She shook her head. "Grace." It was the first time he'd used her name. She'd told it to him the night before, not thinking much about it at the time. Hearing it from him now felt strange, almost intimate, like something that required permission she hadn't consciously given. "Unless what?" "Unless you knew which direction you were going," she said. "You said probably north." He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him work through it, not emotionally, not the way most people made decisions, but practically the way a man with a map works out a route. Terrain, supplies, risk, time. "I could ride north," he said finally. She didn't let herself react visibly. "That's not the same as saying you will." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He looked at her over his coffee cup. "Who's after you? And don't say nobody." She considered the shape of the truth and how much of it to give him. It was a calculation she'd made many times, how much to tell to whom when. Too much, and people became frightened or opportunistic. Too little, and they became surprised at exactly the wrong moment. "My father arranged a marriage," she said. "I was 19. The man he arranged it with, his name is Percy Graves. He has money-land connections. He also has a temper that he doesn't control, and a belief that what he pays for belongs to him entirely." She paused. "I left on the 3rd night. I had to." Jake said nothing. His face didn't change, But something in his stillness changed, and she had the sense that whatever had prompted him to step between her and Cutter's hand in the saloon was listening very carefully to what she was saying. "Graves put a man named Dawson on my trail," she continued. "He's been following me through 4 counties. He gets close, I move. I've been moving since October." "It's March," Jake said. "Yes." 5 months. "Yes." "Alone." She looked at him steadily. "Alone." He was quiet for a long time after that. The fire crackled. The horses moved. Somewhere up the creek, a bird was making its first light sounds in the scrub. "You told me about Hutchins's men last night," Jake said, "but Dawson's your real problem." "Hutchins's men are a problem right now," she said. "Dawson is a problem that follows. Both at the same time is—" She let that finish itself. "Yeah," he said. "You could still go your own direction," she said. "I'm not asking you to take that on." He put down his coffee cup. He stood up with the careful, deliberate movement of a man whose joints had opinions about cold mornings that he had learned to negotiate. He looked at the camp at the lean-to, at the horses at the fire at her, and seemed to be making some internal accounting. "You got a gun?" he asked. "A pistol, .32 caliber. "Can you use it?" "Yes." He nodded once like that settled something. "We leave at first light tomorrow. Give your horse 1 more full day. You ride easy until she tells you she's ready to go faster." He picked up his coffee cup again. "And don't argue with me about whether I'm taking this on. I already decided." Grace opened her mouth, closed it. Something complicated moved through her chest: gratitude and suspicion, and the particular discomfort of someone who had learned not to accept help because help always came with a price. She looked at him and tried to find the price. She couldn't see one. That she thought was either the best sign she'd encountered in 5 months, or the most dangerous. That evening Cutter came back. Not to the camp. He didn't know about the camp. He came back to the saloon with 4 more men and told the bartender that the stranger with the quiet hands had made a mistake that was going to catch up with him. The bartender, a careful man named Ollis, who had survived 12 years in Bitter Creek by never volunteering information, said nothing useful. But a boy who ran errands for the saloon heard everything. And because the boy's mother had once been helped by a traveling woman with tired eyes and a lame horse. He walked north along the creek in the dark and found the camp by the firelight and stood at the edge of the darkness until Grace saw him. "Mr. Cutter's got men looking," the boy said. "6 of them. They know you're in town, mister. Somebody told." Jake looked at the boy. "How old are you?" 12. "Your mother know you're out here?" "No, sir." "Go home," Jake said. He reached into his coat and produced a silver dollar which he held out. The boy looked at it like it was something out of a different world. "Don't say you came out here. Don't say you saw anything." The boy took the dollar and ran. Jake turned to Grace. "We leave tonight." "The horse. Slow is better than caught," he said. He was already moving, breaking down the camp with the same efficient economy. He did everything quick, sure, no wasted motion. Grace started rolling her bedroll. Her hands were steady. That surprised her a little. "Jake," she said. He stopped. "Thank you," she said. Just that. Without qualification. Without the careful hedge of someone who didn't want to seem like they needed too much. He looked at her for a moment. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We're not clear." He was right. They rode north into the dark with the creek on their left and the stars overhead, and 6 of Hutchins's men beginning to spread out through Bitter Creek, asking questions, following answers, moving in the particular patient, dangerous way of men who were certain they had time on their side. They were wrong about that. But Grace Porter didn't know it yet, and neither quite did Jake Sullivan. What they both knew, and neither would have said aloud, was that somewhere in the last 24 hours, 2 people who had learned to survive alone had made a choice that neither of them had made in a very long time. To not be alone. The night held them. The trail opened ahead. And behind them, Bitter Creek began to ask questions that were going to follow them north. Not just from Cutter, not just from Hutchins's riders, but from the other pursuit, the patient one. The one that had been tracking Grace Porter across 4 counties for 5 months. Dawson was 3 days east, and he was getting closer. They rode for 3 hours before Jake called a stop. Not because he was tired. Grace could tell the difference. Tired stopped differently than tactical stopped. Tired stopped with slumping shoulders and a long exhale. This was Jake pulling up on the gray and sitting very still for a moment, listening to something she couldn't hear. Yet his head tilted slightly to the left, the way a man does when he's separating sounds from each other in the dark. "What is it?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "Nothing yet," he said. That's the point. He meant if they kept riding at this pace on this trail, there would eventually be something. He was choosing where and when to stop before circumstances chose for him. Grace understood that kind of thinking. She'd been operating on a version of it for 5 months, though hers was born of desperation rather than discipline. They moved off the main trail into a stand of brush along the creek and waited. Nothing came. After 20 minutes, Jake let out a slow breath and dismounted. "We'll rest the horses here till first light. Then we move fast." "How fast can we move with her leg?" He crouched and ran his hand down her mare's foreleg in the dark, reading it by touch. "She's walking sound. She'll tell us when she's not." Grace dismounted. Every muscle in her back and legs voiced a complaint that she overruled. She had slept maybe 3 hours in the last 2 days, real sleep, the kind that actually rested something. The rest had been that half-conscious hovering state she'd learned in the first weeks after leaving Millard County. Not asleep, not awake, one ear always running. She sat against a tree and pulled her coat tighter. Jake sat a few yards off back against another tree facing the direction they'd come from. "You're not going to sleep," she said. "I'll sleep later." "You slept last night?" "Some." She watched him in the dark. He had the particular quality of stillness that she was starting to recognize as specific to him, not the stillness of someone waiting for something to happen, but the stillness of someone who had made peace with the fact that things were going to happen regardless, and who had positioned himself accordingly. "Were you a soldier?" she asked. A pause. "Yes." "Which war?" "The one that ended in 65, he said. No further detail. She did the math. He looked to be somewhere in his late 30s, which meant he'd gone in young, maybe 16 or 17, which meant he'd seen things before. He was fully formed that had done the forming for him. She understood that kind of education. Not the same war, not the same type of violence, but the principle was familiar. Something happens to you at a critical age, and it sets you in a direction, and you spend the years after either walking in that direction or fighting it. Jake Sullivan was not fighting it. He had simply become what it made him, and he was carrying it without drama. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Having a unit. People around you." He was quiet for a moment. "I miss trusting the men beside me," he said. "That part I miss. The rest of it I don't." "What happened to them? The men you trusted?" He looked at the dark for a while before answering. "Some of them made it, some didn't." Another pause. "One of them I couldn't get to in time. I've been working on that one ever since." The way he said it, flat careful like he'd measured those words many times before speaking them, told her it wasn't a simple story, and that he wasn't going to tell it tonight, and that she should not push on it. She didn't. "Sleep," he said. "I've got the watch." "You don't have to, Grace." The flatness in his voice wasn't unkind. It was just the voice of someone who had decided something and was not going to relitigate it. "Sleep." She slept. She woke to gray dawn and the smell of coffee, which meant he'd risked a small fire, which meant he'd judged them far enough from pursuit that the risk was acceptable. That judgment she trusted entirely without knowing quite why she trusted it yet. He handed her a cup. She drank it standing up, watching the horses, which were calm, and horses she'd learned were better early warning systems than most people gave them credit for. "We're going to cross the main trail north of the creek ford," Jake said, studying the ground ahead. Stay off the Bitter Creek Road entirely. The harder way. The less watched way. How much longer does it add? Half a day, maybe more with her leg. He nodded at her mare. We'll know by midday how she's holding. They rode. The country north of Bitter Creek was broken terrain, rough, rocky. The kind of land that didn't invite casual travel, but rewarded people who knew how to read it. Jake knew how to read it. He picked lines through the landscape with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years learning how the land thought where it dipped and where it rose and where a man on horseback would be visible against the sky and where he wouldn't. Grace watched him and learned because she was always learning, because the alternative was being outpaced by events. By mid-morning, her mare was holding sound. By noon, she wasn't. Grace felt at first the subtle break in rhythm, the fractional hesitation in the left foreleg's landing. She pulled up before Jake said anything. He came alongside and they both looked without speaking because they both already knew. "How bad?" she asked. He dismounted and checked. His face when he stood up told her before his words did. "She needs 2 more days. At least. 2 days they didn't have." "I can ride double with you," Grace said. "To the next town. If there's a livery. Nearest town's Gully Fork, 12 miles. He looked at the terrain ahead. "And it's not a town I'd choose to be seen in if Hutchkins has friends, which he does." She felt the familiar arithmetic starting up again. Options, obstacles, costs. She ran it fast and came up empty. "Then what?" "Martinez Ranch," he said. "Tom Martinez. 8 miles east-northeast. I know him." "You trust him?" He thought about that for a second. Actually thought about it, rather than just reassuring her. She appreciated that. "He's a fair man," Jake said finally. "He doesn't get involved in other people's trouble as a rule, but he won't sell us out either. That's not the same as trusting him." "No," Jake agreed. "It's not, but it's what we've got." She looked at her mare. The horse looked back at her with the patient, honest eyes of an animal that had tried her best and had nothing to apologize for. Grace felt something tighten in her chest. Not grief exactly, not yet, but its early cousin. "All right," she said. "Martinez Ranch." Yet. They reached it in the early afternoon, Grace riding double behind Jake on the gray, her mare on a lead line walking carefully. The ranch announced itself with the sound of cattle and the smell of turned earth before anything was visible, a working operation big enough to have hands structured enough to have routines. Tom Martinez met them in the yard. He was a broad man, maybe 50, with the deliberate movements of someone who had built everything he owned with his hands and intended to keep it that way. He looked at Jake with recognition, then at Grace with assessment that was careful but not unkind, then at the lame mare with the frank evaluation of a man who dealt in horses and knew exactly what he was seeing. "Sullivan," he said, "you look like you've had a morning." "And then some," Jake said and swung down from the gray. He held up a hand for Grace, which she took without thinking about it, and noticed afterward that she'd taken it without thinking about it, which was the kind of thing she usually thought about a great deal. "Tom Martinez," the rancher said, extending his hand to Grace. "Grace Porter," she said, and shook it firmly, because she'd learned that a firm handshake in a man's world told them something useful about you before you had to say anything. Martinez glanced between them. "Trouble following you." "Behind us," Jake said. "How far behind, I'm not certain." "Hutchkins' people." "Some of them." Martinez turned that over. He looked at the ranch, at the hands moving across the yard, at the buildings at the gate behind them. He was calculating the way a man calculates when the math involves other people's safety as well as his own. Grace watched him do it and did not try to influence the outcome. "Get the horses in the barn," Martinez said finally. "Come inside. I'll hear the whole of it before I decide anything." Yo. They sat at his kitchen table, and Jake laid it out plain and without embellishment. Bitter Creek, the saloon cutter, the 6 riders, the night ride north, the lame horse. He told it the way he told most things, facts in their order. No decoration, no apology. Grace added what she needed to. She told Martinez about Percy Graves and the arranged marriage and Dawson on her trail. She told it the same way, plain clean, without asking for sympathy. Martinez listened to all of it with his hands flat on the table and his eyes moving between them, reading not just the words, but the space between the words. When they were done, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. "Graves," Martinez said, "out of Millard County." Grace went still. "You know him." "I know of him," Martinez said carefully. "He's got business connections to 3 men in this territory that I could name right now. One of them is Hutchkins." He let that sit for a moment. Grace felt the floor shift. She had known in some vague, half-formed way that the men pursuing her occupied the same world. But a direct connection, Graves to Hutchins's men in Bitter Creek the same night Dawson was closing in from the east, that wasn't coincidence and pursuit. That was coordination. That was something organized and patient and larger than she'd understood. She heard her own voice say, "He sent Hutchins's people too." "I don't know that for certain," Martinez said. "But I'd bet on it." Jake was looking at her. She could feel it without looking at him. That particular quality of attention, reading her response, adjusting his understanding of the situation, the same way she was adjusting hers. "How long have they been coordinating?" she asked, and the steadiness in her own voice surprised her. "That I can't tell you." Martinez stood up and moved to the window. "What I can tell you is that Hutchins doesn't send 6 men after a stranger who knocked one of his boys around in a saloon. That's not how he operates. 1 man, maybe 2 enough to send a message. 6 means someone asked him to." Jake said very quietly, "Graves." "That's my reading," Martinez said. The room was quiet again. Grace sat with it. The full shape of it assembled itself slowly like a picture coming into focus. Percy Graves, sitting in his house in Millard County, having made a single calculation after she'd run, that the easiest way to find a woman with no resources was to flood her likely path with men who owed him favors and then let the net pull tight. Dawson from the east, Hutchins's riders from the south. Whatever was waiting north that she didn't know about yet. She had not been running. She had been being herded. "I need to know if there are men ahead," she said. "I'll find out," Martinez said. He turned from the window. "You can stay here tonight, both of you. I won't lie to a man who comes asking questions, but I'm not going to volunteer anything either." "We're grateful," Jake said. "Don't be grateful yet," Martinez said, and Grace thought that was the second time she'd heard that particular phrase in 24 hours, and both times it had been true. Martinez put Grace in his spare room and Jake in the bunkhouse. Grace sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, without lying down, her hands in her lap, running through everything Martinez had said. Coordinated pursuit. Graves and Hutchins connected. The path north potentially watched. She had believed she was ahead of it. She had been wrong. That was not a comfortable thing to sit with, the specific cold discomfort of realizing that your best thinking had not been good enough, that the situation was more dangerous and more deliberately constructed than you'd understood. She sat with it anyway, because the alternative was falling apart, and she had decided a long time ago that falling apart was a luxury she couldn't afford until she was somewhere it was safe to do it. She was not there yet. There was a knock at the door. Soft, brief. "Come in," she said. Jake opened the door but didn't come through it. He stood in the frame, hat in hand, looking at her with that careful, direct attention. "How are you doing?" he asked. It was such a simple question, such a normal question, the kind people asked each other all the time without meaning much by it. The way Jake asked it was different, not a social formality, not a pleasantry, an actual inquiry, the kind that assumed an actual answer. She almost said fine. "Scared," she said instead, and angry, mostly angry. Something in his expression shifted, not surprise, more like recognition, like he'd been expecting the scared part, and the angry part was the one that told him something new about her. "Good," he said. "Good." "Angry means you're thinking straight," he said. "Scared without angry makes bad decisions. Angry keeps you sharp." She looked at him for a moment. You speak from experience. Considerable, he said without irony. She took a breath. Martinez said Graves and Hutchkins are connected. That means this isn't... I thought I was just running ahead of one man. I've been running inside something much bigger. Yes. That changes things. Yes, he said again. It means I can't just get to Laramie and hope Graves gives up. He's not going to give up. He has the infrastructure to not give up. Jake was quiet for a moment. What are you thinking? I'm thinking I need to understand what I'm actually dealing with before I decide where to go. She met his eyes. And I'm thinking that you walking away from this is going to be harder than you thought when you decided to ride north with me. He didn't argue with that. I know what I signed on for, he said. Do you? Because 24 hours ago, you were a man passing through Bitter Creek who stepped in on a saloon situation. Now you're inside a coordinated pursuit operation run by a man with land money and connections across the territory. I know that. And you're still here. I'm still here, he said simply. Grace looked at him for a long moment. She was trying to find the angle, trying to locate the place where his reasons became something other than what they appeared to be, where the help revealed itself as leverage. She couldn't find it. She had looked for it at every turn in the last 24 hours and come up empty every time. Why? She asked. Honestly, you have no reason to... Because it's the right thing, he said. And because I've walked away from the right thing before, when it cost too much, and I'm still paying for that. I'd rather not add to the debt. The silence after that was full. She thought about what he'd said at the campfire the night before, about a man he couldn't get to in time. About working on that ever since. She thought about the kind of guilt that doesn't diminish, that just becomes part of the architecture of a person, load-bearing and permanent. She understood that kind of guilt. She carried her own version of it, different specifics, same weight. All right, she said. Then we figure this out together. He nodded once. Moved to go. Jake. He stopped. I need to know something about you, she said. Not your history. Just, are you a man who finishes what he starts? He looked at her steadily. I've never left something unfinished that mattered, he said. She believed him. After he pulled the door closed, she lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and let herself think about what it meant. What it actually meant that there was a person on the other side of that wall who she believed without reservation. After 5 months of trusting no one fully, after years before that of learning that trust was a thing that got used against you, the simplicity of it was almost startling. She believed him. She didn't know yet what to do with that. Martinez's man came back at sundown with information that hit the room like a stone into still water. There were 2 riders camped on the North Trail. They had been there for 3 days, not moving, not passing through. Waiting. They matched the description of men known to work for Hutchkins, which meant Graves had indeed anticipated the northern route and blocked it. And from the east, a lone rider had been asking questions in every settlement between here and the county line. Quiet, patient, methodical. Dolson. He was not 3 days out anymore. He was 1 day out, maybe less. Jake heard this standing at the fireplace in Martinez's front room, his back straight, his expression unchanged. Grace heard it sitting at the table with her hands flat on the wood in front of her, and felt the net she'd imagined pulling tighter, by exactly the measure that made her understand how little room she had left. He's moving faster than I expected, she said. He knows you're down a horse, Jake said. He's pushing because he thinks you're slowed down enough to catch. He's right that I'm slowed down. He's wrong about the catch. She looked at him. How? Because he's expecting you to keep running north, Jake said. He turned from the fireplace. And you're not going to. Martinez, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, said, What are you thinking, Sullivan? I'm thinking that running inside a net just pulls the net tighter, Jake said. The way out of a net is to stop moving and find the hole. He looked at Grace. Graves needs you back. Why? She didn't answer immediately. Not because of sentiment, Jake continued. Not a man like that. He needs you back for a specific reason. What is it? She had thought about this before, turned it over in the long, lonely hours of writing. When I left, she said slowly, I took something with me. Not intentionally, not even consciously at first. There was a document in my bag I'd packed fast. I didn't realize it was in a leather folder my father had given me, and inside it was a land agreement. Between Graves and my father. Signed. She paused. I didn't understand what it was until weeks later when I actually read it. The agreement transfers mineral rights on 3,000 acres of my family's land to Graves, but the signature on my father's line... She stopped. Martinez straightened off the doorframe. What about the signature? It's not my father's handwriting, she said. I know my father's handwriting. I grew up reading it. Whoever signed that document was not my father. The room was absolutely quiet. Jake looked at her with that calm level attention. You have that document? I have it. Yes. Where? She touched the inside of her coat. Here. Every day. I've carried it every day since I understood what it was. And Graves knows you have it, Jake said. It was not a question. He must. He's been too persistent for it to be only about a runaway wife. She paused. That document in the right hands, a judge, a land commissioner, it would expose a fraudulent transfer. Possibly criminal. Definitely enough to destroy his reputation and his business arrangements. She looked at both of them. He's not trying to bring me back because he wants his wife. He's trying to get that paper back before someone with authority reads it. Martinez said something under his breath that was not polite. Jake said nothing for a moment. Then, that changes the equation. In what direction? Grace asked. In the direction of offense, instead of defense, he said. He looked at Martinez. Tom, you know a land commissioner in this territory, someone with authority and the backbone to use it. Martinez rubbed the back of his neck. I know a federal judge out of Cheyenne who owes me a conversation, not a favor, a conversation. That's enough, Jake said. Is he reachable? By telegraph. There's a station in Milford 20 miles west. Dawson will expect her to run north or east, Jake said. He turned to Grace. He won't expect her to go west. Grace looked at the map of it assembling in her mind. Offense instead of defense. Stop running inside the net and find the hole. 20 miles west to a telegraph station. One message to a federal judge in Cheyenne. Not a permanent solution, not yet. Not without more, but a move, a forward move, instead of a retreat. She thought about 5 months of retreating. 5 months of counting exits and calculating escape routes, and sleeping with one ear running. She thought about what Jake had said about angry keeping you sharp. West, she said. Jake looked at her steadily. It's going to be a hard ride. I know. If Dawson figures it out. He won't figure it out until we're already there, she said. He thinks I'm running. People who are running don't send telegraphs to federal judges. Something happened in Jake's expression, then just briefly, just a flicker. Not a smile exactly, more the contained interior version of one, the kind that doesn't quite reach the face, but reaches the eyes. The kind that says, I see what you are, and I wasn't wrong about it. No, he agreed. They don't. Martinez looked between them. I'll have 2 horses ready at midnight, he said. Mine, not yours. Fast ones. He looked at Grace directly. And I want to see what's in that document before you go. Not because I doubt you, because if this goes where you're pointing it, you're going to need a witness who can speak to what's in it. Grace reached inside her coat. She placed the leather folder on Martinez's table and slid it across to him. He opened it. Read it again. When he looked up, something in his face had changed. The careful neutrality of a man who had committed to not getting involved in other people's trouble was gone, replaced by something harder and more certain. This is a forgery, he said. I've seen enough land agreements in this territory to know it on sight. The notary seal is Millard County, but the notary listed has been dead for 2 years. Grace had not known that last part. She absorbed it. It's worse than I thought, she said. It's a federal crime, Martinez said. Land fraud, forged documents, fraudulent transfer of mineral rights. He closed the folder carefully and slid it back to her. Sullivan, you'd better get her to that telegraph station. Jake was already moving, and in the darkness east of Martinez Ranch, 1 day's ride away and closing, Dolson made camp and sharpened his knife and told himself that by tomorrow night it would be finished. He had no way of knowing that the woman he'd been chasing for 5 months had just stopped running. They rode out of Martinez Ranch at midnight with 2 of his best horses and the cold pressing down on them like a hand on the back of the neck. Grace didn't look back. She had learned not to look back, not because the past wasn't real, but because looking backward while moving forward was how people rode into things they didn't see coming. The lesson had cost her twice in the first weeks after Millard County, and she'd paid attention both times. Jake rode half a length ahead, reading the dark the way he read everything quietly, methodically, without wasted effort. He had said almost nothing since they'd left Martinez's table. She'd noticed that about him. When a situation shifted significantly, he went quieter rather than louder. Most people responded to urgency by talking more. Jake responded by saying less and processing more, and the results of that processing tended to be worth waiting for. The document sat inside her coat against her ribs. She had felt its edges every day for 5 months, and it had always felt like a weight, something to protect, something that made her a target, a liability dressed as an asset. Tonight, for the first time, it felt like something else, a weapon. "How far ahead do you think we are?" she asked, keeping her voice low, even though there was no one to hear. From Dolson. "Half a day, maybe more. He'll come to Martinez looking for us by tomorrow noon." Jake glanced sideways at her. Martinez won't lie, but he won't rush to tell the truth either. That buys us something. "And the 2 men on the North Trail? They're watching north. We're going west. They won't know to move for hours after Dolson gets there, and Dolson will have to figure out where we went before he can point them in the right direction." He looked at the dark ahead. "We have a window. It's narrow, but it's real. And if the telegraph station is closed when we get there?" "Then we wake up the operator," Jake said. "People who work telegraph stations don't usually argue with men who knock loud enough." She almost smiled at that. Almost. They rode. Todd. The first hour passed without incident, which Grace had learned to treat not as safety, but as information. The absence of trouble told you something about the shape of the trouble that was coming if you were paying attention. The second hour, her horse picked up the pace without being asked, which meant the animal had found its footing on this terrain and was willing, and that was worth something. Midway through the second hour, Jake said, "Tell me about the document. Not tell me about Graves. Not tell me about your father. Tell me about the document, the specific factual thing at the center of this, the thing that could be held and read and acted upon." She appreciated the precision. "My father's name is Edward Porter," she said. "He had 3,000 acres in Millard County, Good Land Creek, watered with mineral deposits that nobody paid much attention to until 2 years ago when a survey came back showing silver. Not a fortune, but enough. Graves found out before my father did." She paused. "My father is not a shrewd man. He's a good man, but not shrewd. Graves approached him about a business arrangement, and my father saw a respected landowner offering partnership, and he said yes to things he didn't fully understand. The marriage was part of it," Jake said. "The marriage was the lock on the arrangement. Once I was Graves's wife, my father's land and Graves's capital became one thing legally. Except..." She took a breath. "Except my father started asking questions maybe 6 months before the wedding. I think he began to understand what he'd agreed to, and he got worried. I think he tried to pull back, and I think Graves decided the cleanest solution was to get the mineral rights transferred before my father could change anything. So he forged the transfer agreement. And then he arranged the wedding quickly, moved the date up by 4 months." Her jaw tightened. "I was not consulted about the date change." Jake rode in silence for a moment. "Your father. Does he know about the forgery?" "I don't know. I left before I could tell him. And I couldn't risk writing to him because anything sent to Millard County goes through people Graves has influence over." She felt the familiar, helpless frustration of that particular wall. He might know. He might have found out and been threatened into silence. Or he might still believe everything is legitimate and wonder why his daughter ran from a good match. If he knew, Jake said carefully, would he stand up? That question sat in the air for a long moment. I used to be certain he would, Grace said. Now I don't know. Graves is the kind of man who finds a person's specific weakness and applies pressure there. My father's weakness is my mother's grave. He's terrified of losing the land she's buried on. If Graves found that lever and used it... She stopped. I don't know what my father would do. That's the honest answer. Jake nodded, accepting the honest answer for what it was. The federal judge, she said. Martinez's contact. What can he actually do? A federal judge can issue a warrant. He can order an investigation into the land transfer. He can put men with authority into Millard County who don't answer to Graves or Hutchkins or anyone else Graves has bought. Jake's voice was matter-of-fact. He can't do any of that based on your word alone. But based on your word, plus that document, plus Martinez as a corroborating witness... He let the sentence finish itself. It's enough to start, Grace said. It's enough to make Graves's situation very uncomfortable, Jake said. And men who are comfortable are patient. Men who are uncomfortable make mistakes. She turned that over. She had been thinking about this entire situation as survival. Get away. Stay away. Eventually get far enough away that it stops. Jake was thinking about it differently. Not escape. Resolution. Forcing a mistake in the right direction. You've done this before, she said. This kind of strategic thinking. This isn't just cowboy common sense. He was quiet for a moment. I scouted for 2 years during the war, he said. Behind enemy lines, mostly. You learn to think about how the other side is reasoning, what they expect, what they're afraid of, where their plans have gaps. He paused. Percy Graves is planning on you running. He's planned everything around you running. The moment you stop running and start moving toward him instead of away, his whole structure has a problem. He'll adapt, she said. Yes, but there's a gap between when he understands you've changed direction and when he can adapt his response. We need to be inside that gap. She thought about that. The gap. The narrow window between when Graves realized what she was doing and when he could stop it. The telegraph to Cheyenne. A federal judge with the authority to act. The document safe in her coat. Narrow, but real. All right, she said. Let's get inside the gap. They reached Milford as the sky was beginning to gray in the east. Not sunrise yet, that particular pre-dawn quality, where shapes existed without full color, where everything was outline and suggestion. The telegraph office was exactly where Martinez had said it would be, a small building, with a lantern still burning low in the window, which meant the overnight operator hadn't left yet. Jake knocked once, twice. A third time, that was less a knock than a statement. The operator who answered was a young man with the disheveled, baffled look of someone yanked from sleep without sufficient warning. He looked at Jake, then at Grace, then at the horses which were blowing steam in the cold. "Telegraph office is open for business," he said with the automatic voice of someone reciting something learned rather than felt. "Good," Jake said. "We need to send a message to Cheyenne. Federal Circuit Court. Judge Emmett Hale." The operator blinked. Some of the sleep fell away from his face. "Judge Hale. Do you have that connection?" "Yes, but it's 4 a.m. "I understand," Jake said. "Send it anyway." They came inside. Grace sat at the operator's desk and wrote the message. She wrote it herself because she wanted the specific words to be precise and because Jake handed her the pen without being asked which was the right instinct. She wrote it twice, once to get the shape of it right, once to get it clean. The message was brief. It named Percy Graves. It named the document Mineral Rights Fraudulent Transfer Forged Notary Seal from a Man 2 Years Dead. It named Tom Martinez as a witness. It gave the location as Milford Territorial, Wyoming. It said, "I have evidence. I need authority to use it. Please advise." The operator sent it. The machine made its clicking rhythmic sound. Grace watched it and felt something shift in her chest, the specific sensation of a thing in motion that could not be called back. Whatever happened next, the message was real, and sent, and somewhere at the other end, a machine was receiving it. "How long for a response?" Jake asked. "If someone's there to receive." The operator checked his clock. "Hour, maybe more." "We'll wait," Jake said. He sat with his back to the wall facing the door. Old habit Grace had come to understand, he never sat with his back to an entrance. She sat beside him close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and did not move away, and he did not move away, and neither of them acknowledged the proximity in any way. That, too, was becoming familiar. The operator dozed at his desk. The machine was quiet. The town outside was still. 20 minutes in, Jake said, "What was your mother like?" The question surprised her, not its content, but its timing, its quiet domesticity in the middle of everything. She thought about deflecting. She didn't. "Patient," she said. Not in a passive way. In the way of someone who understood that most things resolve themselves if you don't panic. She paused. "She died when I was 14. Fever. It was fast 4 days from healthy to gone." She looked at her hands. "My father was never quite the same after." "Is that when he became easier to manage?" Grace said, before he could find a polite word for it. "Yes, when she was alive she balanced him. She knew what he was, and she knew what he wasn't, and she'd spent 20 years making sure his weaknesses didn't become his family's problems." A beat. Without her, there was nobody between his naivety and the world. Jake said nothing for a moment. "And you tried to fill that?" It wasn't a question. She looked at him. "Not successfully," she said. "You were 14. I was 19 when Graves came along, and I still didn't stop it." "You were 19, Jake said, with the same quiet flatness as if repetition of the fact was sufficient argument. "And Graves had spent years learning how to do what he did. You don't blame a person for losing a fight they didn't know they were in." She held that. It was not comfortable. Comfort was not the point. The point was accuracy, and it was, she had to admit, accurate. She had not known what kind of fight it was until she was already 3 months into a marriage that felt like the inside of a closed fist. "What about you?" she said. "Your family." He was quiet for a moment, not reluctant considering the way he did with everything. "My mother and a younger sister in Ohio. I haven't been back since the war." "Why not?" "Because the man who left was not the man who would come back," he said. "And I didn't know how to explain that. Still don't." He looked at the wall across from them. "My sister writes sometimes. I write back. It's enough for now." "Do you think you'll go back eventually?" "I don't think about eventually much," he said. "Eventually is a long way from where I'm standing." Grace understood that. She had stopped thinking in long timelines. Somewhere around the 2nd month of running, the future had compressed down to the next town, the next meal, the next night's shelter. Thinking too far ahead when the present was this precarious was a way of falling into despair. "What do you want?" she asked him. "If you could have anything. Not eventually. Just what is the thing you want?" He turned and looked at her directly. In the thin pre-dawn light coming through the window, his face was clearer than it had been, the tiredness in it. Yes, but something else too. Something underneath the tiredness that had not been entirely extinguished. "I want to wake up in a place I chose," he said. "Not a place I ended up because there was nowhere left to go. A place I actually chose because I wanted to be in it." He paused. "I want one morning where the first thought isn't what could go wrong." She looked at him. "That's not much," she said softly. "It's everything," he said. The telegraph machine began to click. Yang. The operator jerked awake. His hands found the keys from muscle memory. He transcribed as it came in his pen, moving across the paper in short practice strokes, and when it stopped, he tore the sheet off and read it, and his eyebrows rose. He handed it to Jake without comment. Jake read it. His expression didn't change, but his posture did. Something in his spine straightened by a fraction, the way a person's body responds to information that matters before the conscious mind has finished processing it. He handed the paper to Grace. The message was from Judge Emmett Hale. It was 7 lines long, The first 3 lines acknowledged receiving her message. The 4th line named 2 federal marshals already stationed in the territory, names locations. The 5th line said, "Proceed to Cheyenne with original document. Both witnesses do not allow document out of your possession." The 6th line said, "Warrant for Percy Graves being prepared on basis of your communication." The 7th line said, "You are under federal protection from this moment. Hail." Grace read it twice. Federal protection. It was a phrase that could mean many things, and might in practice mean less than it sounded. 2 marshals in a territory this large were not a guarantee of anything. But it meant there was now a structure above the one Graves had built something he could not buy, or threatened something with the weight of federal law behind it. She became aware that her hands were not entirely steady. "He moved fast," Jake said. "Martinez must have sent his own telegram before we left," Grace said. "He said he knew the judge, a conversation, he called it. He'd already had part of the conversation before we got here." Jake nodded slowly. "He was ahead of us on this." "He's been watching Hutchkins operate in this territory for years," Grace said. "He was waiting for something with enough weight to move on." She looked at the telegram again. "We just gave him the weight." The operator was watching both of them with wide, carefully neutral eyes. The look of a man who understood he was witnessing something that was above his pay grade and was determined to have no opinion about any of it. "Get us a copy of that," Jake said. "Yes, sir," the operator said immediately. Grace folded the original carefully and put it inside her coat beside the document. 2 pieces of paper that together constituted the most dangerous thing Percy Graves had encountered in his very comfortable, very controlled life. She stood up. "We need to move," she said. "Dawson is—" The door opened. Not Jake's warning version of opening, not the operator's version. It opened the way doors open when someone on the other side has decided they are not going to knock. The man in the doorway was not Dawson. He was one of the 2 riders who had been camped on the North Trail. He was holding a rifle already leveled. Grace's hand went to her coat, not for the documents, for the pistol under her arm that she'd worn every day for 5 months and had practiced drawing until the motion was as natural as breathing. She didn't draw it. Not yet. "Hands," the man said. Jake's hands came up slowly, with the particular measured quality of someone who was not afraid of the rifle, so much as he was accounting for it, tracking where it was pointed, what angle it presented, what the room looked like behind her, in case that angle changed. "How'd you find us?" Jake said. "Operator's assistant," the man said. "Boy who opens up at 4. He rode out to tell us somebody was sending wires to Cheyenne." He looked at Grace. "Mr. Graves wants you home, Mrs. Graves." She felt her stomach turn at the name. She had not been called that in 5 months, and she did not intend to be called it again. "I'm not his wife," she said. "That's not what the paperwork says." "The paperwork," she said steadily, "was arranged by a man who forges documents. I'd be careful about citing his paperwork as authority." Something flickered in the rider's eyes. Uncertainty just briefly. He hadn't expected her to be calm. He hadn't expected a woman who had been running for 5 months to stand in a telegraph office at 4 in the morning and argue law with him. That flicker was the gap. Jake moved, not toward the rifle that was what the rider was watching for. He moved sideways fast and low, putting himself between the rifle and the operator and clearing the line from Grace to the door at the same time. The rider swung the barrel to track him, which moved it away from Grace, which was the point. Grace drew the .32. "Put it down," she said. The rider looked at her. At the gun. At Jake, who had stopped moving and was now simply standing very still again in his way, watching the rifle with the patient attention of someone doing math. "There's another man outside," the rider said. "There usually is," Jake said. "Call him in or leave him out there. Either way, you're the one with a gun pointed at you right now." The standoff lasted 4 seconds. Grace counted them. She was counting everything, the way she had always counted. Everything, exits and threats and variables, but this time with a steadiness that surprised her. She was not shaking. Her breathing was controlled. Her grip was firm. The rider lowered the rifle. "On the floor," Jake said. Not loud, just clear. The rifle went down. Jake had it in his hands in 2 steps. He unloaded it efficiently and handed the cartridges to the operator, who received them with the expression of a man encountering a situation for which his training had not prepared him. "The second man outside," Jake said to the rider on the floor. "What's his name?" "Cole." "Is Cole the kind of man who shoots first or waits to understand the situation?" "Waits," the rider said after a moment. "Usually." "Good." Jake looked at Grace. She was already moving toward the door. She opened it. Cole was outside 10 feet away, his hand on his holster, but not drawing the weights type true to description. He looked at her. At the doorway behind her where Jake was visible with his captured rifle. At the situation. "My name is Grace Porter," she said. "I am traveling under federal protection as of 1 hour ago, authorized by Judge Emmett Hale of the Cheyenne Federal Circuit. The man you work for is about to be the subject of a federal warrant for land fraud and document forgery. You have a choice right now. You can continue to work for him, or you can be somewhere else when that warrant arrives." She held his gaze. "I'd recommend somewhere else." Cole looked at her for a long time. He looked at his partner, visible through the doorway, sitting on the floor. He looked at the dark around him, and then at the eastern horizon, where the first real light of dawn was beginning to separate sky from land. He took his hand off his holster. "I got a sister in Denver," he said, not quite to anyone. "Been meaning to visit." He walked to his horse, mounted, rode west, not north, not east, not back the way he'd come. Grace watched him go. Jake came and stood beside her in the doorway. "That was well done," he said quietly. "I meant every word of it," she said. "I know. That's why it worked. Why?" The dawn was coming in properly now. Real light, real color bleeding into the sky. Grace stood in it and let herself feel the specific quality of this moment. Not safe, not finished, not free of danger by any measure she could name. Dawson was still coming. The warrant was just a piece of paper until someone enforced it. Cheyenne was far, and the road to it was uncertain. But she had stopped running. She had sent a telegram to a federal judge. She had stood in front of a rifle and said her name clearly. She had watched a man choose his sister in Denver over a fight he was losing. And beside her stood someone she trusted, which was a thing she had believed 2 days ago she might never have again. "We need to ride," Jake said. "I know." "Dawson will be at Martinez's by noon. He'll know which direction we went by too. We've got hours, not days." "I know," she said again. She turned and looked at him fully in the new light, and he looked back at her with those steady eyes. "Jake." "Yeah." "When this is over—" She stopped herself. Old habit. Don't make plans that assume a future you haven't earned yet. "When this is over," he said, "you can finish that sentence." She nodded. They went to get the horses. Behind them inside the telegraph office, the machine began to click again. This time, outgoing the operator sending the record of the morning's events to the territorial office in Cheyenne, because a man who understood which way the wind was blowing had decided that a federal judge's protection was worth documenting quickly. 2 miles east and closing, riding hard now because someone had told him which way the wire had gone. Dawson reached for the extra cartridges in his saddlebag and rode faster. He was not going to let 5 months of careful work end in a telegraph office. He was not going to let her reach Cheyenne, and he was not going to stop for anything between here and wherever she was. He didn't know yet that the woman he'd been hunting had stopped being prey. They were 2 miles west of Milford when Jake pulled up hard. Grace reined in beside him. She didn't ask. She had learned that when Jake stopped moving without warning, the correct response was to stop moving and wait, because whatever he was reading in the landscape, or the sound, or the quality of the air, was information she hadn't processed yet. He was looking north. "Rider," he said, moving fast, coming down from the ridge. She looked. She couldn't see anything yet, just the empty gray of early morning terrain. Then she did a single shape against the sky, moving at a pace that was not casual. "1 man," she said. "1 man we can see," Jake said. Dawson doesn't work alone. You think he has backup? A man who tracks someone for 5 months through 4 counties doesn't do it without support he can call on. He was already calculating, she could see it, his eyes moving, reading the land for options. He's coming from the north, which means he didn't go to Martinez first. He cut the angle. That landed wrong in her stomach. He knew we'd go west. Or he guessed and guessed right. Jake looked at her. How well does he know you? Well enough, she said, and hated the truth of it. Dawson had been on her trail long enough to understand her patterns, the way she moved, the way she reasoned, the kinds of choices she made under pressure. He had been wrong about enough of them to not catch her in 5 months. But 5 months of being wrong about someone still taught you things. We can't outrun him on this terrain, Jake said. Not with these horses after a night's ride. So we don't run. He looked at her. We've been having this conversation repeatedly, she said. Every time we've stopped running, we've gained ground. I'm not interested in reversing that. Jake held her gaze for a moment. Then something in his expression settled. Not satisfaction, more like alignment. The specific quality of a man whose thinking and another person's thinking have arrived at the same place simultaneously. There's a creek crossing about a mile ahead, he said. Good ground on the far side, high enough to see in every direction cover on both flanks. If we get there before he closes the distance, then we choose the ground instead of him choosing it, she said. Go. They rode. They made the crossing with minutes to spare. Jake picked his position fast, the efficient, no-wasted motion decisions of someone who had done this under worse conditions than morning light and known ground. He tied the horses back from the ridge and came up to where Grace was already watching the approach. Dawson was closer now, close enough to read. He was a lean man on a dark horse, riding with the forward-leaning urgency of someone who had stopped being careful and was now just being fast. Which meant he knew he was close. Which meant someone had told him which direction they'd gone from Milford. The telegraph boy, Grace thought. The same boy who'd sold them out to the rider in the office. Of course he'd told Dawson too. Children who ran errands for money told whoever paid them. He's going to see our tracks at the crossing, she said. Yes, Jake said. He'll know we came up here. Then he'll know we're waiting. Yes. Then why are we waiting if he knows? Because he doesn't know how many of us there are, Jake said. And a man who's been chasing one woman for 5 months has calibrated himself to deal with one woman, not 2 people who have been moving and thinking together for 3 days. He glanced at her. You've been alone this whole time. He's counting on you still being alone. That's his blind spot. She thought about that. You're going to let him come up. I'm going to let him commit to the approach, Jake said. Once he's committed, he can't pull back to cover, and then we talk to him. Talk to him. He's a hired man, Jake said. Not a true believer. He gets paid for results. The result he's been working toward just changed shape significantly. There's a federal warrant in motion. Graves is about to have very large problems, and the woman he's been chasing is no longer a fugitive, but a witness under federal protection. He looked at her calmly. I want to give him the opportunity to do the math. Grace watched Dawson cross the creek below. He paused at the tracks reading them, and his head came up scanning the ridge. He found them. Of course he did. That was what he was good at. And he went very still on his horse for a long moment. Then he came up anyway. That took a specific kind of nerve that she would have respected if the nerve wasn't being applied against her. He stopped 15 feet away with his hand resting on his holster and his eyes moving between the two of them with the professional assessment of a man taking inventory. Mrs. Graves, he said. Porter, she said. My name is Grace Porter. Dawson looked at Jake. Sullivan, he said, which confirmed he had done his research. He knew who Jake was, which meant Graves had done more homework on her movements than she'd realized, which was a cold thought. You know me, Jake said. Know of you. Millard County records show you and Miss Porter left Bitter Creek together. He said it without accusation, just the flat recitation of information, the way a professional delivers facts. Mr. Graves asked me to bring her home. Miss Porter is traveling to Cheyenne under federal protection, Jake said in the same flat register. Judge Emmett Hale, Federal Circuit. Warrant in preparation for Percy Graves on charges of land fraud and document forgery. He paused. You might want to think about what bringing her home looks like now. Dolson's expression didn't change, but his hand moved fractionally away from his holster, just a fraction the body's involuntary response to information that complicated a plan. He was listening. Jake had read him correctly. Graves didn't mention federal jurisdiction, Dolson said carefully. Graves didn't know about it until this morning, Grace said. It moves fast when the evidence is solid, and the evidence is very solid. A silence. Dolson looked at the horizon. The calculation he was doing was visible in the set of his jaw. Not a stupid man, which was what had made him effective for 5 months, and not a reckless man either, which was what had kept him patient. Show me, he said finally. The federal protection. Show me documentation. Grace reached into her coat and produced the telegram. She held it where he could read it without coming closer. He read it twice. She could tell by the pace of his eyes. He handed it back without comment. Another silence, longer this time. I want it in writing, he said. That I cooperated. Jake looked at him. You can ride into Cheyenne with us and make a statement to Judge Hale directly. That carries more weight than a letter. And if I do that, Dolson said slowly, my employment with Graves is finished. Your employment with Graves is already finished, Grace said. The man you've been working for is facing federal charges. The question is whether you're facing them with him or standing on the other side of the room when it happens. Another long moment. Dolson looked at Jake. You'll vouch for me, in front of the judge. If your cooperation is genuine, Jake said yes. Dolson reached up and took his hat off. He ran a hand through his hair in the gesture of a man letting go of something he'd been holding tightly. Then he put the hat back on. I've been following this woman for 5 months, he said, not quite to either of them. Longest job I've ever worked. He looked at Grace directly, and there was something in his face that was neither hostility nor apology, just the plain, unvarnished look of a professional regarding someone who had bested him. You're harder to catch than I told him you'd be. I had a lot of practice, Grace said. Yeah, he said. I noticed. He fell into line behind them without further discussion. They hadn't ridden a mile before Jake said quietly, so only Grace could hear. That was too easy. She had been thinking the same thing. Not that Dolson's cooperation wasn't real. She believed it was real enough. She believed he was a practical man who understood changed situations and adjusted accordingly. But Dolson wasn't the full picture, and they both knew it. He said you'd need backup you could call on, she said. He said Dolson doesn't work alone. Jake was already looking. He came from the north, he said, but he wasn't the first one there. She understood immediately. If Dolson had cut north to intercept them coming west from Milford, he'd come from somewhere. And if he'd known to cut north if someone had read the situation correctly and positioned him there before she'd even sent the telegraph. Then the information architecture behind this was more sophisticated than a man waiting for word from a boy in a telegraph office. Who told him to go north? She said. That's the question, Jake said. She looked over her shoulder at Dolson. He was riding with his eyes forward, expression neutral, giving no indication of either threat or concealment. Either he was genuinely done, or he was exceptionally good at appearing genuinely done. She had trusted her own judgment twice in the last 3 days, and both times it had been right. She trusted it now. Dolson, she called back. He looked up. Who positioned you north of Milford before we got there? A beat. Then Graves has a man in this territory. Not Hutchkins, someone separate. Moves between the towns, watches the telegraph lines. Name? Jake said. They call him Reeves, Dolson said. I don't know his real name. He rides a sorrel dresses like a cattle buyer. Graves pays him to watch the wire traffic across the territory. Grace felt cold settle in her chest. A man watching telegraph lines meant that Graves had known about her message to Judge Hale almost as fast as Hale had, which meant the warrant, the thing she was counting on, was not a surprise. "He knows," she said to Jake. "He knows?" Jake agreed. "Then he's moving already, not waiting. If he knows a warrant is coming, he'll try to make the problem disappear before it arrives," Jake said, and they were both thinking the same thing. The problem in this case was the document inside her coat and the two people who could testify to its contents. "How far to Cheyenne?" she asked. "Full day's ride, maybe more." "And the nearest federal marshal?" Martinez said Red Bluff Station, 40 miles south of Cheyenne. "That's too far." "Yes," Jake said. Dawson pulled up alongside them. "There's a way to shorten this," he said, "if you're willing to trust me a little further." They both looked at him. "I know where Reeves is working out of," Dawson said. "Little station called Harker's Bend, 12 miles north. If we get there before he reports back to Graves, before he tells Graves which direction you're moving and what you're carrying, we slow down Graves's response by half a day at least." Grace looked at Jake. Jake looked at Dawson. "Why would you help us do that?" "Because if Graves gets his response organized before you reach Cheyenne," Dawson said plainly, "none of us makes it to Cheyenne, and I'd like to make it to Cheyenne." The logic was sound. That was either the mark of someone genuinely on their side now, or someone who had been instructed to get close enough to them to know exactly where they were going and when. Jake made the call. "We go to Harker's Bend," he said. "But you ride ahead of us, Dawson, not behind." Harker's Bend was a supply stop, barely a settlement, just a trading post and a water trough, and two small buildings that served passing travelers. They came in from the south with Dawson in front, as Jake had specified, and Grace's hand inside her coat the entire way, and Jake's eyes never stopping their steady turning survey of everything around them. Reeves was there. He was exactly as described, a compact, forgettable man at the post's hitching rail, dressed like someone who bought and sold cattle, with a sorrel horse and a posture designed to communicate that he was waiting for nothing in particular and nobody worth noticing. The only thing that gave him away was the way his eyes moved when they rode in too systematically in the pattern of someone professionally cataloging arrivals. He saw Dawson first, then Jake, then Grace. His hand moved toward his coat. "Don't," Jake said. He had closed the distance between them. While Grace was still reading the situation, she hadn't even seen him move, and she was watching. He was simply suddenly there, 2 feet from Reeves, with the kind of proximity that made reaching for anything inside a coat a very poor decision. Reeves processed this. "I'm just a cattle buyer," he said. "Then you don't have anything in that coat worth reaching for," Jake said, "and you can move your hand back to where I can see it." The hand moved. Jake reached into Reeves's coat and removed a small pistol and a folded paper. He handed the pistol to Grace and unfolded the paper. He read it. His jaw tightened by a fraction. He handed it to Grace. It was a message already written and ready to send, addressed to Percy Graves, Millard County. It said, "Subject heading west toward Cheyenne with Sullivan and evidence. Moving fast. Recommend intercept at Canyon Pass. Canyon Pass." Grace looked at Jake. "There's only one Canyon Pass between here and Cheyenne," she said. "I know," he said. "If Graves gets that message—" "He already has men there," Jake said. "Or he's sending them." He looked at Reeves. "Did you send a prior message before we got here?" Reeves said nothing. "Did you send a message?" Jake said, with the quiet and specific weight of someone who was going to have this question answered regardless. "An hour ago," Reeves said. "I saw you come out of Milford. An hour ago." Jake looked at Grace. The calculation was visible, and it was not good. An hour was enough time for Graves to have riders moving toward the Canyon Pass. Not enough time to have them positioned yet, maybe, depending on where they'd started from, depending on how many Graves had ready. "We can't go through the Canyon Pass," Grace said. "No," Jake agreed. "Is there another route?" He was already thinking. She could see it, that interior stillness that meant his mind was working at a pace his face didn't advertise. "There's a northern route, longer, Rougher terrain. Add 6-7 hours to the ride. But no canyon. No canyon. She looked at Dolson. He had been watching this whole exchange with the focused attention of someone integrating new information rapidly. The northern route goes through Crow Ridge, he said. Graves has contacts in Crow Ridge. Contacts or men? Jake asked. Contacts, not the same thing. He'd have to send word and wait for them to mobilize. That's a delay. How much of a delay? Dolson considered. 4 hours? Maybe 5. Jake looked at Grace. We take the northern route. We ride through the night if we have to. What about him? Grace looked at Reeves. Dolson. Jake said, can you take him to Martinez? Keep him there until this is finished. Dolson thought about this for a short moment. Yes. Grace looked at Reeves directly. He was looking back at her with the careful blankness of a man who had been caught and was now waiting to understand what that meant for him. She felt no particular anger toward him. He was a tool same as Dolson had been, same as Cutter had been. The hand using the tools was the thing that mattered. Tell him something from me, she said. Tell Graves that the document is already in federal hands, that the original is logged with Judge Hale's office and 3 copies exist in 3 separate locations. She let that sit for a moment. Tell him there's nothing left to intercept. Reeves blinked. Is that true? Does it matter? She said. It wasn't true the document was still in her coat, but by the time Graves received that message, processed it, and decided whether to believe it, they would have 6 hours head start on the northern route. 6 hours was not a guarantee, but it was a gap worth creating. Dolson almost smiled. I'll tell him, he said. They rode north. The terrain was harder, as Jake had said, broken and demanding the kind of riding that required attention and cost energy and gave nothing back. Grace rode it without complaint. She had ridden worse, eaten worse, slept worse. Her body was tired in the specific deep way of someone running on determination, past the point where the physical reserves had run out, and she was long past apologizing to herself for it. 2 hours into the northern route, Jake said, You holding up? Yes, she said. You can tell me if you're not. I know, she said. I'm telling you yes. He looked at her for a moment, not disbelieving, reading the way he read everything, trying to get an accurate account. He must have found one because he nodded and looked back at the trail. An hour later he said, I want to ask you something. Ask. When this is done. He paused. That pause was significant. Jake Sullivan did not pause when he was confident in what he was saying. When Graves is dealt with and the warrant is executed and your father's land is back in proper hands, what do you do? She looked at the trail ahead of her. The question had a shape she recognized. It was the mirror image of the question she'd tried to ask him in the telegraph office before she'd stopped herself. When this is over. I don't know, she said honestly. I've been surviving so long, I'm not sure I remember what the alternative looks like. Living, he said. The alternative is living. Easy word, she said. Hard practice, he agreed. I know. He rode for a moment. I've been trying to get back to it for 12 years. She looked at him. The morning had moved toward afternoon real light, now full and clear, the kind that didn't hide anything. She looked at him in it and saw the same things she'd been seeing since the saloon in Bitter Creek, just more clearly now. A man who was tired in the bones, who had built walls not out of coldness, but out of self-protection, who had kept those walls for so long, he might have forgotten they were structures and not skin. You stepped between me and Cutter, she said. That's not what a man does who's given up on things mattering. He didn't answer immediately. No, he said finally. I guess it isn't. She made a decision. She had been making small decisions for 3 days, each one a fraction more forward than the last, a fraction more toward the thing she wasn't ready to name yet. She made this one the same way. I want to stay in Wyoming, she said. I want land eventually. I want something that's mine because I chose it, not because I inherited it, or was given it, or was married into it. I want to wake up in a place I chose. She glanced at him. You said that last night. I want the same thing." He was looking at the trail. "That's a good thing to want," he said. "Is it something you still want?" The question sat between them, riding in the space between their horses on the narrow northern route, very specific and very clear. Jake turned and looked at her. In the full afternoon light, with everything stripped down to what it actually was after 3 days of running and deciding and trusting, he looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them was pretending anything. "Yes," he said. "It's something I still want." She nodded, said nothing else. Neither did he. But something had been established between them. Not promised, not planned, just named, which was its own kind of beginning. They rode. The ambush came at the creek crossing. She heard it before she saw it, the specific sound of a horse moving fast through brush, not the casual movement of an animal, but the driven movement of one being urged quickly and quietly into position. Her body responded before her mind caught up, heels pulling in hand, going to her pistol. "Left," Jake said, and he was already moving right, which meant he'd heard it too, and had already worked out the geometry. 2 men came out of the brush on the left bank. Not Hutchkins' riders, not Dolson's type. These were men who moved with the particular deliberate violence of professionals, not the bar fight swagger of Cutter or the tracker's patience of Dolson, but something harder and more purposeful. Graves's own men, she understood. The ones he kept close, not farmed out to local operators. The first shot went wide of Jake by a foot. Grace fired once from horseback at the man who'd fired not to hit him. She was too far, and the horse was moving, but to make him move, to make him adjust, to buy the second it took Jake to get behind cover. He went behind cover. The man went for his second shot. She rode straight at the creek. It was not the tactical choice Jake would have made, she knew that. It was the choice of someone who had made a sudden, certain calculation that the creek crossing was the only ground between here and open terrain where she could not be shot off a horse with any ease. She hit the water and went across, and came up the far bank, and dismounted in one motion behind a deadfall with the .32 in her hand. Jake came across 30 seconds later, the gray moving fast and water flying, and he came down beside her, breathing hard, with a rifle he'd had in the scabbard that she hadn't seen him draw. "2 on the left," she said. "Did you see any on the right?" "No, but they had to come from somewhere." "They were waiting," she said. "Reeves sent a second message. Before we got there he said an hour, but maybe it was more. Maybe he sent one before and one after." "Or Graves anticipated the northern route," Jake said. "He's been ahead of you before." She felt that land. He had in fact been ahead of her before the net, the herding the way Dolson and Hutchkins's men had been positioned. Graves was not a stupid man. He had been running a long game from the beginning. "He knows this territory," she said. "Better than we do," Jake said. Silence. On the far bank the 2 men had gone quiet. Not retreated, just repositioned. That was more disciplined than Cutter's riders. These men knew how to wait. "How far to Cheyenne?" Grace asked. 12 miles. "And the federal marshal station?" 8. 8 miles, she said. "If we can get 8 miles. "The terrain between here and there is open," Jake said. "They'll be able to track us and keep pace." "Can we draw them out?" she said. "Make them commit to a direction and then Grace." His voice was careful. She stopped. "I need you to take the horses and ride south," he said. "Hard as they'll go. Don't stop, don't look back. 8 miles to the marshal station. You know what to say when you get there." She looked at him. "No. You have the document. You are the witness. You are the case." His voice was not gentle, not harsh, just precise, the way he was precise about everything. "If we both stay here, 2 men with rifles and covered ground, pin us until Graves sends more. If I go, you're alone against 2 men with rifles." "I've been in worse positions," he said. "That's not actually reassuring." "It is, though," he said. "It actually is." She looked at him. The deadfall between them and the far bank. 8 miles of open ground to the south. The horses behind them still standing, Somehow she'd tied them fast in the drop from the saddle-trained reflex. "You come after me," she said. "As soon as you can, you come after me." "Yes," he said. "Not eventually. As soon as you can." "Yes," he said again. And then with that same quiet directness that had been the note of him from the beginning, "I told you I finish what I start." She held his gaze for one more second. She took the horses and she rode. Behind her on the creek bank, the first shot came. Jake returning fire-controlled and measured, covering her retreat with the patience of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had stopped being frightened of the cost of doing it right. 8 miles. She rode like the whole territory was behind her, because most of it was. And somewhere in Millard County, Percy Graves received a message from Reeves that made him go very still at his desk and reach slowly for his coat, because the woman he had underestimated from the beginning had just walked inside the protection of federal authority, and the walls of everything he had built were beginning to shake. She rode those 8 miles the way she had ridden everything in the last 5 months forward, without looking back, with the specific, controlled desperation of someone who understood that hesitation was the thing that got you killed, not speed. But this time was different. Every other ride had been away from something. This one was toward something. That distinction kept her seat in the saddle when her arms wanted to shake and her lungs wanted to quit, because there was a federal marshal station 8 miles south, and a document inside her coat, and a man on a creek bank behind her who had said, "I finish what I start," and she was going to make sure that statement had something to come back to. She heard 2 more shots behind her as she crested the first rise. Then silence. The silence was worse than the shots. She did not stop. The marshal station at Red Bluff was a low building with a flag that needed replacing, and 2 horses at the rail that looked like they'd been ridden recently and rested well. She came in at a pace that made both animals throw their heads, and she was off her horse before it fully stopped, and she went through the door without knocking. 2 men inside, one at a desk, one at the window. Both came to their feet at the same time, with the trained reflex of men who understood that a woman arriving at that speed with that expression meant the situation outside was not a social call. "Marshal Tate," she said. "That's me," the man from the desk said. He was perhaps 50, with a gray mustache and the unhurried solidity of someone who had seen enough urgency in his career to stop being rattled by its arrival. "What's your situation?" she told him. All of it fast and clean. Graves the document, the warrant from Judge Hale, the creek crossing 8 miles north. Jake Sullivan, holding 2 armed men so she could ride. She put the telegram from Hale on his desk while she talked. She put the leather folder beside it and opened it to the forged transfer agreement. Tate read both while she was still talking. He was the kind of man who could listen and read simultaneously. She liked him immediately for that. When she finished, he was already reaching for his gun belt. "Reardon," he said to the man at the window, "get the horses." He looked at Grace. "This man at the creek, Sullivan, he a good shot?" "Yes," she said. "Good enough to still be alive in the time it's taken you to get here." She held Tate's gaze. "Yes," she said with a certainty she was choosing, rather than feeling, because feeling it would require acknowledging the alternative. "Then let's not waste any more of his ammunition," Tate said. They rode back north at a pace that left no room for conversation, which suited Grace entirely. She rode between the 2 marshals and concentrated on the specific task of staying in the saddle for 8 more miles after a night and a day of riding, because collapsing now was not something she was willing to do. She heard the gunfire before they crested the last rise. Still going, which meant Jake was still going. She came over the rise and read the situation in 3 seconds. Jake was behind the deadfall on the south bank. Same position she'd left him in, and he had moved a piece of the deadfall to give himself a different angle. The 2 men on the north bank were pinned. They'd tried to cross, and Jake had made that expensive, and now they were caught in a position where staying put was wrong and moving was worse. Marshal Tate assessed this in about the same 3 seconds. He did not call out or announce. He simply rode down to the bank with Reardon flanking left, and when one of Graves's men tried to reposition toward better cover, Reardon was already there, and the repositioning stopped. Federal marshals, Tate called. Hands where I see them. Both of you. Now. A pause that lasted 4 seconds and felt like 4 minutes. Both men came out with their hands up. Grace let out a breath that she had been holding, she realized, since she'd crested the rise. Jake stood up from behind the deadfall. He was bleeding from a cut above his left ear, not serious, the angled kind from something that had come close and grazed rather than hit. But it was blood on his face, and her stomach tightened at the sight of it, even as she registered that he was standing upright and moving with his usual deliberate economy, which meant nothing structural was damaged. He looked across the creek at her. She looked back at him. There were no words for the 8 miles between them and this moment, so neither of them tried. He waded the creek and came up the south bank and stopped in front of her horse and looked up at her with those steady, calm eyes. "You made it," he said. "I told you I would," she said. Her voice was almost level. "You did," he agreed. She dismounted. She stood in front of him with the creek sound behind them, and 2 federal marshals handling Graves's men 15 yards away, and she looked at the cut above his ear and said, "That needs cleaning." "Probably," he said. "Does anything else need attention?" He considered that for a moment, honestly, the way he considered everything. "No," he said. "I'm all right. I'm all tivul." She nodded. She put her hand briefly against his arm. Not dramatic, just contact, brief and solid, and then turned to where Marshal Tate was finishing with the prisoners, because there was still work to do, and she was not done doing it. Tate sent Reardon back to Red Bluff with the 2 prisoners, and rode with Jake and Grace the remaining distance to Cheyenne. He was a quiet man on the trail, which she appreciated, and he asked his questions one at a time, and listened to the complete answer before asking the next one, which she appreciated more. By the time the lights of Cheyenne were visible in the early evening, he had a full account of everything from Bitter Creek forward, and his expression had the set quality of a man who had formed a solid opinion that he was not going to revise. "Graves is going to say the document is fabricated," Tate said. "First thing his lawyer will argue. The notary seal is from a man 2 years dead," Grace said. "Tom Martinez can testify to that. Dawson can testify to the scope of Graves's operation in the territory. And there's a handwriting discrepancy on my father's signature that any examiner with basic training will identify." "Your father," Tate said. "Will he testify?" That question. She had been carrying it since Martinez's kitchen table, turning it over the way you turn over something you're afraid to look at directly. "I believe he will," she said. "When he understands the full situation, when someone explains to him that his silence protects a man who forged his name and stole 3,000 acres of his land." "That someone being you," Tate said. "That someone being me," she agreed. Jake, riding on her right, said nothing. But she was aware of him listening, and his listening had the particular quality it always had, not passive, not simply receiving information, but active, the kind that occasionally produced observations worth having. "Graves will move on your father," Jake said to Tate. "If he doesn't have him already, he'll try to secure him as a variable he can control, before the warrant reaches Millard County." Tate looked at him. "How fast do you think he moves?" "He had men at the Canyon Pass and men at the creek crossing," Jake said. "He was ahead of us by half a day at multiple points. He's not slow." Tate reached into his coat and produced a small notebook. He wrote something, tore the page out, and handed it to Grace. "When we reach Cheyenne, you're going to give that to Judge Hale's clerk. It's a request for an additional warrant protective order for your father, Edward Porter, Millard County. Hale can execute it faster than Graves can move if we get it in tonight." Grace looked at the paper. "You had this ready." "I had the form of it ready," Tate said. "Your situation filled in the specifics." He looked at her with the plain, evaluating respect of a man who had done this long enough to recognize which witnesses were solid and which ones were going to fall apart under pressure. "You've kept your head through something that would have broken most people. That's going to matter in front of Hale." "It's going to matter to my father," Grace said quietly. Tate nodded once and went back to watching the trail. "Sure." Judge Emmett Hale was a tall man with white hair and the brisk, slightly impatient manner of someone who understood that most problems presented to him were the result of someone somewhere having behaved badly, when a small amount of integrity would have prevented the whole thing. He received them in his office at 7 in the evening without any indication that this hour was unusual, because in his experience, the hour at which justice arrived was rarely convenient, and he had stopped expecting it to be. He read the document. He read it for a long time. He looked up at Grace. "You carried this for 5 months." "Yes, sir." "Across 4 counties." "Yes, sir." He looked at the document again. The notary seal. "A man named Curtis Farrow," Grace said, "died 18 months ago. Tom Martinez can confirm he knew Farrow personally." Hale set the document down with the careful precision of a man handling something that mattered. He looked at Tate. "The protective order for the father. Tonight," Tate said, "if it's possible." "It's possible," Hale said. He looked at Grace one more time, not assessing her story. He had already done that, but assessing her. The way she was sitting, the way she had told it. Whether the 5 months, and the riding, and the creek crossing, and all the rest of it, had produced someone who would hold together through what came next, or someone who was going to fracture. "Miss Porter, what do you want?" She looked at him steadily. "I want my father's land returned to him," she said. "I want the transfer agreement voided. I want Percy Graves to answer for the forgery in a court with authority over him." She paused. "And I want my name back. Not Porter again." "I never stopped being Porter, but legally clearly with no confusion about the status of the marriage he arranged. The marriage was performed under fraudulent circumstances," Hale said. "That's voidable." He made a note. "It will require your father's testimony about the arrangement. Is that something he'll provide?" "Yes," she said. This time with less qualification than she'd given Tate. She had made a decision on that trail somewhere between the creek crossing and Cheyenne. She was going to believe her father would do the right thing, and she was going to go to Millard County and tell him what the right thing was, and she was going to stand in front of him and be the person who had survived 5 months of his mistake, and that would have to be enough to move him. If it wasn't, she would figure out what came next, but she believed it would be. Hale signed 3 documents in the next 20 minutes. The warrant for Graves' land fraud document forgery, fraudulent marriage arrangement, the protective order for Edward Porter, and a formal declaration of Grace's status as a protected federal witness, which had the practical effect of making any further effort by Graves or his people to interfere with her a federal crime compounded on top of the existing charges. He handed her the copies. "This is going to take time," he said. "Courts don't move the way riders do. Graves will have lawyers, and they'll be good ones. This is not finished tonight." "I know," she said. "But it started," he said. "Tonight it started properly." She folded the documents and put them inside her coat. The leather folder with the transfer agreement stayed on Hale's desk, logged and witnessed, and no longer hers to carry alone. She felt the absence of it against her ribs, like the removal of a weight she had forgotten was there. They stayed in Cheyenne that night, real beds, a real roof, the first time in days. Grace lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and ran through the last 5 days with the systematic thoroughness of someone who needed to understand what had happened before they could determine what it meant. 5 days ago, she had been a runaway woman in a saloon in Bitter Creek with $11 and a lame horse and no plan past the next town. Tonight she was a federal witness, with 3 signed warrants and the beginnings of a legal case that was going to reach into Millard County like a hand and rearrange everything Graves had spent 2 years building. She had not done that alone. She thought about Jake in the room 2 doors down, and the way he had stood up from behind that deadfall and looked at her across the creek, and the way neither of them had needed words for what that moment contained. She thought about what he'd said on the Northern Trail. "I want to wake up in a place I chose," and what she'd said back to him, and the thing that had been established between them that was not a promise and not a plan, but was unmistakably real. She slept. In the morning, word came from Tate that the protective order had been served on Edward Porter in Millard County before midnight. A federal deputy had ridden through the night. Her father was safe, the deputy reported, and when he'd been shown the documents, the warrant for Graves, the voiding order on the transfer agreement, the copy of the forged signature beside his real one, he had sat down heavily in a chair and put his face in his hands. Then he had asked for paper and written a statement. 4 pages. Everything he knew about Graves, and the arrangement, and the pressure that had been applied, and the things he had been threatened with, and the things he had been afraid of. 4 pages in his own handwriting which Grace knew, like she knew the sound of her own name, and which no one would be able to dispute, was real. Tate read her the summary of it. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. He knew, Grace said. Not a question. He knew something was wrong, Tate said carefully. He may not have known the full extent. He knew enough, she said, and he didn't stop it. No, Tate said. He didn't. She sat with that. It was not a new pain. She had been carrying the shape of it for months. The knowledge that her father's failure was not ignorance, but something closer to cowardice. The specific cowardice of a man who sees the right thing and chooses the comfortable thing instead. She had loved him anyway. She did love him still. But the love had the complicated, careful quality now of something that had been tested and found to be durable, but not intact. She would see him when this was done. She would have a conversation that was going to be hard and real and necessary. That was a future thing, a living thing rather than a surviving thing. Jake knocked twice and came in when she said, "Come in." He looked at her face and read it accurately without asking. He sat in the chair across from her and waited, which was exactly right. "My father wrote a statement," she said. 4 pages. "Good," Jake said. He knew something was wrong, and he didn't stop it. A pause. "That's a hard thing." "Yes," she said. "It is." She looked at him. "I'm not going to pretend it isn't, but I'm also not going to let it be the thing that defines what comes next. I've been letting other people's failures define my direction for 2 years. I'm done with that." He looked at her for a moment. "What defines your direction now?" "I do," she said, simply. Like it was obvious. Like it had perhaps always been obvious, and she had simply needed to ride 8 miles alone to understand it completely. Jake was quiet for a moment. Then, good. And there it was again, that word, that single, uncomplicated word of his, delivered with the same weight it always carried from him, which was the weight of someone who meant exactly what he said and never said what he didn't mean. 3 weeks later, Percy Graves was arrested at his home in Millard County by 2 federal marshals and Tate himself, who had made the trip personally. His lawyers were good, as Hale had promised they would be, but the forged notary seal was from a dead man, and the handwriting examiner confirmed the signature discrepancy, and Edward Porter's 4-page statement was entered into the record, and Dawson testified for 2 hours about the scope and coordination of the pursuit, and Tom Martinez testified about the notary and the land transfer practices he'd witnessed in the territory, and it was more than enough. The transfer agreement was voided. The mineral rights reverted to Edward Porter. The marriage was formally declared void under fraudulent circumstances, which restored Grace's name so cleanly and completely that it was as if the previous 2 years had been a legal error, which in fact they had. Grace was not in Millard County for any of it. She had given her testimony to Hale's court in Cheyenne in writing and in person, and she had answered every question with the same steady precision she had developed over 5 months of having nothing but precision to protect her. And when it was done, she had walked out of the courthouse into the Wyoming afternoon and stood on the steps for a moment with her face turned up to the sky. Jake was waiting at the bottom of the steps. He had been in Cheyenne through all of it, not hovering, not crowding. Just present, in the way he was present for everything, which was useful and calm and without demand. He had given his own testimony about the creek crossing and the Marshall station and the events in Bitter Creek, and he had done it in the same flat, accurate, unembellished way he did everything, and Hale's clerk had noted in the margin of the transcript witness credible. She came down the steps. He looked at her. She looked at him. "It's done," she said. "Almost," he said. "Your father." She nodded. That conversation was still ahead. She had written to him twice since Cheyenne letters that were not forgiving and not condemning, just honest, which was harder than either. He had written back. The correspondence had the careful, tentative quality of two people learning to speak a new language to each other, which she supposed was accurate. "I'm going to see him," she said. "When I'm ready, not yet." "Okay," Jake said. "I want—" She stopped, started again. "I want to do it from a place I've chosen. Not as a woman with nowhere to go who has to ask her father for shelter. From somewhere that's mine." He was looking at her steadily. "Martinez offered," he said. "You know that." "I know." Tom Martinez had offered her work on the ranch managing his books and his correspondence, which had been in disorder for years and which her mind had already been involuntarily reorganizing from the moment she'd sat at his kitchen table. It was real work, paid work, work that required her actual skills. It was a start. "You going to take it?" Jake asked. "Yes," she said. "Are you staying in the territory?" He looked at her for a long moment. The Wyoming afternoon was full around them, wide and bright and unhurried, the kind of day that didn't rush anything. "I've been moving for 12 years, he said. "I'm tired of moving." "Martinez's ranch is north of Bitter Creek," she said. "I know where it is," he said. "He needs a foreman," she said. "He mentioned it." "He mentioned it to me too," Jake said. She looked at him. He looked at her. And in the space between them was everything that had accumulated over the last 3 weeks. The creek crossing, and the telegraph office, and the Northern Trail, and two people who had been moving alone for too long, finding that moving together was not as it turned out. The burden they'd each separately feared it would be, but something closer to the opposite. "It wouldn't be simple," she said. "I'm not simple." "I don't want simple," he said. "Simple is boring." She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh clean and real, rising up without permission. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed like that. Jake looked at her with something in his face that she was learning to read, that interior contained quality, that in another man would be a wide smile, but in him was something quieter and more permanent. "I have conditions," she said. "Tell me," he said. "Equal standing," she said. "I work, I earn, I decide. Not permission, not asking, equal." "Yes," he said immediately. "And if I need to go to Millard County, if I need to deal with my father or the land or anything left over from all of this, you don't decide whether that's worth doing. I decide." "Yes," he said. "And you tell me the truth," she said. "About what you're thinking, about what you're caring about when something is wrong. Not all at once. I'm not asking for all at once. I know that's not how you're built. But eventually, as things come up." He was quiet for a moment, not resisting considering with that genuine, careful quality she had stopped trying to rush weeks ago. "I can do that," he said. "It won't be easy." "I'm not asking for easy," she said. "I'm asking for real." "Real I can do," he said. She nodded. She looked at the Wyoming sky and at the street of Cheyenne around them, and at the man in front of her who had walked into a saloon in Bitter Creek looking for a quiet hour and had ended up somewhere neither of them had planned. "All right," she said. "Martinez Ranch." "Martinez Ranch," he agreed. They married on a Tuesday in October, 6 months after Bitter Creek, on the open ground north of Martinez's ranch house, with the wind coming down from the mountains, and Tom Martinez standing as witness, and the two horses, Jake's gray and Grace's mare, fully sound now, and stubborn as ever, tied at the fence rail nearby. The ceremony was short. Grace had written her own words, which was the only version of this she had been willing to accept, and she said them clearly and without hesitation, because she had practiced being afraid, and she had practiced surviving. And now she was practicing something harder than either, which was letting herself have what she had chosen. Jake said his words in the same way he said everything, plain, without decoration, with the weight of a man who understood that a thing said simply and meant absolutely was worth more than any amount of eloquence that covered uncertain ground. When it was done, Martinez shook Jake's hand and kissed Grace on the cheek and said, "About time," which made her laugh again, that clean surprise laugh she was slowly relearning. That evening, sitting outside the ranch house with the last of the light going out of the sky and the sound of the ranch settling into its nighttime rhythms around them, Jake said, "One morning." She looked at him. "That's what I wanted," he said. "One morning, where the first thought isn't what could go wrong." He looked at the dark coming in at the edges of the sky. "I think I might finally be in the right place to find that." Grace looked at the same sky. She thought about Bitter Creek, and the saloon, and the $11, and the lame horse, and the document in the leather folder, and the 8 miles, and the creek crossing, and the courthouse steps, and all the distance between there and here. "You are," she said, and she meant it the way he meant everything, completely without reservation, with the full weight of someone who had survived enough to know the difference between what was real and what was wished for, and who had, against considerable odds, and through considerable cost, managed to find the one thing harder to hold on to than anything else she'd ever carried. Not escape. Life. The kind she had chosen, with the person she had chosen in the place she had chosen, and that at last was enough.